Okay, so, you sent over some stuff for us to look at, and one thing that really stood out was this idea that sometimes it feels like government decisions are made, kind of in a bubble
Hmm.
without really considering what people, actually want or think.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because one of the articles you sent actually asks this question, like, straight out, are we prisoners of our own doing?
Oh, wow.
Like, it makes you think, right? And that's what we're going to try to unpack today using the stuff you shared.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this.
Yeah, so just to give everyone a quick overview, we've got limited public input in democratic policymaking 2020-2025,
Okay.
which is super interesting. It breaks down specific situations where it seems like there wasn't much public consultation,
Right.
and it looks at this across different policy areas in different countries.
Okay.
And then we've got the article, Are We Prisoners of Our Own Doing?, which is more kind of like a big picture look at this whole thing.
Interesting.
So what we really want to do is pull out the key insights from these sources
Yeah.
so we can help you understand, like, what's happening when people feel like your voices aren't being heard,
Hmm.
in terms of how things are run and, like, what happens as a result of that kind of disconnect.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So where do we want to start with this?
Well, maybe we could begin with censorship laws.
Okay. Yeah.
Because both of the sources touch on this idea of regulations around online content, like what we can see and say online,
Right.
and how those are sometimes implemented very quickly.
Yeah, you're right. It does seem like in the digital age, things move so fast
Absolutely.
that sometimes, like, the rules are trying to catch up, but maybe a little too quickly for there to be enough public discussion.
Yeah, I think a good point.
And the limited public input document has some pretty clear examples.
Oh, okay.
Like, let's take India, for instance.
Right.
In February 2021, they put in place these information technology rules.
Mhm.
And the report points out that they were fast-tracked without public consultation or a pre-legislative consultation.
Mhm.
And that's according to the EFF, by the way, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So
Right.
they know their stuff when it comes to digital rights.
For sure.
And the big concerns were about how these rules would impact privacy and freedom of expression for people in India.
That's understandable. I mean, what's interesting to me here is that governments often say this kind of quick action is necessary,
Yeah,
to protect citizens from like misinformation or harmful content.
right. Like they're trying to do the right thing.
Exactly. And that's highlighted in your second source, too.
Mhm.
But the speed at which it's done and the lack of public input, well, that can set off alarm bells right away.
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder.
Like, who gets to decide what's harmful?
Right, exactly.
If there's no public debate, it can feel like those in power are overstepping their boundaries.
I totally agree. And it's not just happening in one place,
Oh, definitely not.
Like Turkey's social media law from July 2020 is another example.
Okay.
That one was pushed through Parliament, according to Human Rights Watch, before the summer recess, which I don't know about you, but that detail really stood out to me.
Yeah, it sounds like they were in a hurry.
Right. Like getting it done was the priority, maybe over having a thorough public discussion.
Yeah, possibly.
And there was a lot of criticism about it.
What kind of criticism?
Well, Human Rights Watch called it a new dark era of online censorship in Turkey.
Wow.
So again, we see this pattern of quick legislation and then worries about what it means for freedom of expression.
It's like a recurring theme.
Yeah, and if we take a step back, it's pretty striking that both sources highlight this feeling of decisions being made for the public instead of with them.
Yeah.
And the Are We Prisoners article actually talks about this specifically.
Right.
It says when people don't have a real chance to shape these censorship laws, or even if they don't really know the details until after they're already in place,
Right.
it can make them feel like they're being controlled by forces beyond their influence.
Absolutely.
And, this isn't just happening in other countries.
Oh, right. Yeah.
North America has seen this too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, remember Canada's Bill C-10, which later became the Online Streaming Act?
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Well, that really sparked a firestorm of criticism, as the source puts it,
Wow.
especially around what it could mean for free speech online.
So even in a country like Canada with a pretty solid legislative process,
Yeah.
there was still this feeling that the impact on online expression maybe wasn't fully understood,
Right.
or that people's concerns weren't being listened to.
Exactly. And for me, the part that really stands out is the proposal they had in July 2021 to deal with online harms.
Okay.
The government said it was a chance for public consultation, but Michael Geist, who's a really respected expert in digital policy,
Yeah.
he basically questioned like how genuine that consultation really was.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he said there were few questions, options, or apparent interest in hearing what Canadians think of the plans.
Hmm.
I mean, that quote really says it all right.
Yeah, it kind of paints a picture of them just going through the motions.
Right, like checking a box instead of really trying to get feedback and incorporate it.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And according to the limited public input document, what happened was a lot of public distrust and fear that these regulations would be too broad and could end up stifling legitimate stuff online.
So basically, even when democratic norms around lawmaking are strong,
Right.
this perception that people weren't being included still caused a lot of unease.
Exactly. And it brings up a really important point about what consultation actually means.
True.
Is it just about telling people what's going on after decisions have been made?
Yeah.
Or is it about really trying to understand people's views and using those to shape policy?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah, and the examples we've talked about so far seem to suggest that when it's more about informing people after the fact,
Right.
it can really lead to that feeling of being a prisoner of decisions you had no part in making.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get even deeper into this.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
And look at another area where this disconnect between government and the public can cause some really strong reactions. Tax policy.
Oh, yeah, taxes always get people fired up.
Exactly. And your sources have some really compelling examples about this, too.
Oh, good.
Because tax policy directly affects people's money, right?
Yeah, of course.
So it's the kind of area where you really hope to see a lot of public involvement.
Absolutely.
And the situation in Colombia back in April 2021 is a perfect example of what can happen when that's missing.
Totally. So President Duque proposed these tax reforms,
Okay.
which included expiring the VAT, that's the value-added tax, which is basically a consumption tax,
Right.
to more things, and also raising income taxes.
Okay.
And this came at a time when a lot of Colombians were already struggling financially.
Oh, wow.
The report says it was seen as something that would hit the middle class and lower income folks the hardest. And there was this strong feeling that the government just wasn't listening to their concerns.
That's a problem.
And the public's response was huge, right? Like tons of people went out into the streets to protest.
Yeah, it sounds like they were really upset.
They were. And what's really telling is that the protests, the 21N protests as they were called,
Okay.
were a direct result of people feeling like they hadn't been listened to.
Right.
And it wasn't just peaceful demonstrations either.
Oh, no.
It got really bad with reports of at least 19 deaths.
That's awful.
Yeah, it was a terrible situation. And in the end, the government had to withdraw the bill completely.
Wow. So they really misjudged the public's reaction.
Yeah, and even the vice president admitted that they failed to appropriately communicate the proposal.
Which basically means they failed to get people on board.
Exactly, and the source points out that that's often code for "we didn't listen."
Yeah, it makes sense.
And there's this image in the source that really captures it all.
Oh, it is it?
It shows these massive crowds of people in Medellin, Colombia, and they're holding signs with slogans like "No a la reforma."
What does that mean?
It means no to the reform.
And it's such a powerful image because it shows how angry people were
Yeah.
and how ignored they felt like they had to take to the streets to make their point.
It's a powerful statement for sure. And this wasn't an isolated incident either.
No, you're right.
In 2023, Kenya had huge public pushback against a finance bill that had big tax hikes in it.
Right.
And again, it seemed like there wasn't much public consultation beforehand.
Yeah, and the part about doubling the VAT on fuel
Yeah.
and introducing new levies was seen as a real burden.
Especially with the cost of living already so high.
Exactly, and just like in Colombia, people took to the streets.
They did.
Yeah, they marched on Parliament,
Wow.
and there were clashes with the police.
It shows you that when people feel shut out of these big decisions about how they're taxed,
Yeah.
they're going to find a way to make their voices heard, even if it means putting themselves at risk.
Absolutely. And what's also interesting about the Kenyan case is that a court actually ruled that the Finance Act was unconstitutional.
They did. Yeah, specifically because there wasn't enough public participation in how it was passed,
Wow.
although that ruling was later overturned.
Oh, okay.
But still, that legal challenge really showed that people felt like they had been left out of the process.
They were validated in a way.
Right. And then we come to the United States, and it might look different there, but the underlying issue seems to be the same.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
Well, the source highlights all the survey data showing that most people actually support raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations.
Okay.
Like, there was this poll from early 2025 that found 63% in favor of it.
That's a pretty significant majority.
Right. But then you look at the big tax laws that get passed, like the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act,
Yeah.
which mostly benefited corporations and wealthy individuals.
It wasn't that popular, was it?
No, not really. And the source reminds us that it passed with very little public input or hearings.
There's a disconnect there.
Yeah, like a big one between what the public seems to want and what actually becomes law. And the source even says that some members of Congress felt like they had to keep their wealthy donors happy.
Oh, wow.
Which really makes you think about how much influence special interest groups have on policy.
Right, and maybe at the expense of what the general public wants.
Exactly. And this ties in with that Princeton Northwestern study that was mentioned.
Oh, yeah, what did they find?
They found that economic elites and these organized interest groups have way more sway over U.S. policy than regular people, who often have little to no influence on their own.
That's pretty disheartening.
Yeah, and Senator Wyden, who is quoted in the source, said that this is why people are losing faith in government.
Which makes sense if you feel like your voice doesn't matter.
Exactly, and the Are We Prisoners article brings up this point about how income tax, which was supposed to be a temporary thing,
Right.
has become permanent in a lot of economies.
Yeah, it has.
And because there's not a lot of transparency or control over how that money is used,
Right.
it can make people feel frustrated and powerless, like they have no say over a big chunk of their financial lives.
So we're seeing a pattern here.
Yeah.
Whether it's censorship laws that impact what we can do online or tax policies that affect our wallets.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like when there isn't much public input, people get dissatisfied.
Yeah, and that dissatisfaction can show up in different ways.
For sure. Like we've seen online criticism, street protests, and just a general decline in trust in government.
Exactly. And that brings us to another area that can be really controversial: carbon taxes and climate policies.
Okay.
This is where you really see the tension between needing to act fast on climate change
Right.
and making sure the public is on board.
Totally, because carbon taxes are often really unpopular,
Yeah,
especially if it seems like the costs are hitting people unfairly,
right.
or if they feel like they didn't have any say in how the tax was put in place.
And the Yellow Vest movement in France is a perfect example of this.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one.
So Macron's government decided to increase fuel taxes as part of their plan to cut carbon emissions.
Oh, okay.
But they did it by executive decision without really consulting the public.
And how did people react?
Well, let's just say that
Really?
the Yellow Vest protests started because of the fuel tax, but they quickly turned into this much bigger anti-government movement
Whoa.
with people expressing all sorts of grievances.
So it was about more than just the fuel tax then?
Yeah, it was about feeling like their voices weren't being heard.
Yeah.
Like they saw this tax as something imposed on them by elites who were out of touch with their everyday lives.
Yeah, especially for people in rural areas who depend on their cars.
Exactly. And the protests in Paris in December 2018 were really intense.
What happened?
Oh, there was a lot of violence and destruction, and it showed just how frustrated and alienated people felt.
So what did the government do?
Well, in the end, they had to back down and cancel the tax hike.
So it really backfired.
Yeah, and the source says that it teaches us a really important lesson.
What's that?
If you try to do something big about climate change, something that affects how much people have to pay for things,
Right.
but you don't really listen to their concerns, it
Yeah.
can blow up in your face.
And instead of getting people on board with climate action,
Exactly.
you end up with a big anti-government movement.
Exactly. And then there's Canada and their national carbon pricing plan.
Oh, right.
That one had more public debate because it went through Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
But there were still some provinces that felt like it was forced on them by the federal government.
Without their consent?
Yeah, and that led to some legal challenges.
Oh, well.
The Supreme Court ended up saying that the federal government did have the power to put a price on carbon,
Okay.
but that didn't mean everyone was happy about it.
No, I guess not.
The debate kept going, and then in October 2023, the government did something kind of surprising.
What was that?
They decided to temporarily pause the carbon tax on home heating oil,
Oh.
and they also increased the rebates for people in rural areas.
So it sounds like they were feeling the pressure.
Yeah, and Trudeau said it was about adjusting policies so that they have the right outcome. You know, recognizing that some Canadians were struggling financially.
Right.
But the source says that a lot of people saw this as a response to Trudeau's dropping poll numbers.
So basically, public opinion still matters, even after a Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, it seems like it does.
And this goes back to that "are we prisoners" idea again.
It does, doesn't it?
Because with carbon taxes, it's often everyday people who end up paying the price, but they don't have much say in how the tax is designed,
Right.
or if there are other better solutions.
So again, it can feel like you're bearing the cost without having a real voice in the decision.
Exactly. So looking across all these examples, from censorship online to taxes to climate policies,
Yeah.
the common thread is that people feel like they're not being given a real chance to influence big decisions.
Right. And the limited public input document wraps this up by talking about a democratic deficit.
Where the consent of the people is just assumed instead of being actively sought out.
Which brings us full circle back to, are we prisoners of our own doing?
It does, doesn't it?
Like, how can citizens feel so powerless even when we have democratic systems in place?
Right. That's a good question. And the sources present this argument that modern democracies might actually be set up to favor the elites, and that what regular people want is often ignored unless there's a ton of public pressure.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. And the limited public input document makes this other really important point.
Okay.
It says that the public can actually contribute to this problem.
Oh, how?
Well, by voting for representatives and then not really paying attention to what's happening in government, or by feeling like their input doesn't matter anyway.
Right.
People might be accidentally creating a situation where decisions are made with less accountability.
So the structures of democracy might make it look like people have control, but the reality might be different.
Exactly. Wow, we covered a lot of ground.
We did. So just to sum up, what are the main takeaways here?
Well, it seems like we've seen how censorship laws can be pushed through really quickly without much public input,
Yeah,
which raises concerns about basic freedoms.
absolutely. And we've also seen that tax policies put in place without consulting people
Yeah.
can make people feel angry and like they're being treated unfairly. For sure.
And even climate policies that are trying to do good, like carbon taxes, can run into trouble
Yeah,
if people feel like they weren't listened to.
exactly. And the common theme across all of this is that feeling of being unheard.
Yeah, of not having a voice in decisions that impact your life.
Right. And it makes you think about that question again. Are we prisoners of our own doing?
Yeah, it really does. And I'm curious to know what you, our listener, think about all of this.
Yeah. Do any of these examples sound familiar to you?
Have you seen this kind of thing happen in your own life?
After all this, what are your thoughts on whether we are in some ways prisoners of our own doing?
That's a deep question.
It is. And as we look ahead,
Yeah.
what do you think needs to happen to make sure people have a real say in shaping democratic policy in the future?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. Or maybe if part of the problem is our own actions,
Like the source says.
what's the first step you would take to change things?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
We hope this is giving you a lot to think about, and maybe you even have your own examples or ideas to share.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.